So we had Jenny last month, now we have Joselle.
Hey guys.
But starting next month, we'll have our first non-museum staff member event. We just don't know what the topic is yet. We have a speaker, we just don't know the topic. So once everything is decided, I'll make another flyer. It'll be on May 11th though, so it'll be a little bit of a quicker turnaround between these events. But welcome, my name is Thomas McClindigan. If you don't know me, I'm the Education and Outreach Manager at the Museum of the Aleutians. And we do like to begin every museum program just by acknowledging that the Museum of the Aleutians and all of our programming is located on the ancestral and unceded traditional territories of the Ununga. And that this program and many of our programs is supported through the support of the citizens of the city of Unalaska, which is the official way of saying the city gives us money and it helps us put on these events and exhibitions and such. But obviously, this is a much more informal event. Again, in the future, if you'd like to bring your lunch, you're more than welcome to. That's the whole brown bag thing. But we'll go ahead and get started, so I will turn it over to Joselle to get started. And again, if you came in a little bit late, I did announce this earlier, we are recording. It's being streamed live to YouTube. And it will also be archived on YouTube after I do a little bit of basic editing. So if you want to go back and watch it again, or in the future, if you can't make it, you can always hop online and watch it there. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you.
Thank you. As Brennan said, my name is Joseele Hale. I am the Collections Manager at the Museum of the Aleutians. For those that don't know me, I got here in January and I've been loving it so far. My presentation today and my talk is going to be on smelting iron from furnace to forge. So what you start with, and then how you end up with rock metallic iron. You can sit here. No, you're good. The back of your head will be on camera though.
Well, that's why I can hear you.
Yep, that's fine. That's fine.
Okay.
You're more than welcome to sit there. Before we start, even though they will not see this, and they would probably be very embarrassed if they heard this, I would like to give special thanks to my two blacksmithing mentors, Al Kerboy and Ethan Schwanier, and to Dr. Robert Gordon, who is a professor at Yale, who helped me with the initial research that I did on this back when I was a practicing blacksmith 2-ish years ago. So, big shout out to them. We'll be really embarrassed about that. So, to start, we kind of have to understand where iron comes from. Iron has existed for as long as the Earth has. It's the fourth most populous element in the Earth's crust. And even before the Iron Age, we had people using metallic iron. So iron that was coming, that was found on Earth from meteoric iron, not metallic, I apologize. That was coming in from meteorites, and they were using that, heating it up, and using that to make iron products before the Iron Age. This is seen in Egypt in 3200 BCE. The earliest record of smelting, which is what we're going to be talking about today, is still in the Bronze Age, which was between a little before 3000 BCE and up to the Iron Age, which is generally agreed upon to be 1200 BCE. It was sporadic and it wasn't used often, but we do have some record of it. The first large-scale iron production that we see is technically in the Bronze Age, because it was in 2200 BCE, and that was in Turkey and Central Africa, and 800 BCE in India. And they had working bloomeries going from these periods onward. And so the Iron Age that we usually talk about, 1200 BCE to about the 1st century, or the 5th century BCE, is the European Iron Age. So that really excludes a lot of the world, but by 1200 BCE, everywhere but the Americas is smelting iron pretty much. As I said, widespread use of iron that was non-meteoric started in 1200 BCE, and it was still widely used up until very recently. Iron was stopped being produced on a large scale for industrial purposes in roughly the 1940s and 50s, and that's when people switched over to just making steel. And I have a little timeline here: the Stone Age, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, and then after that you get into the historic periods of time. These are prehistoric. And if anybody has any questions, please feel free to ask. So what is iron and where do we find it? Iron is its own element, and it can be forged and created into alloys such as steel. Steel is an alloy of iron and carbon, and so is cast iron. Cast iron is also an alloy of iron and carbon, but just of a higher percentage of carbon, and that makes all the difference. As well as having different types of steel. To make stainless steel and things like that, to add different properties, you add different types of elements, and add different things to make different alloys. Iron can be found as ore in numerous places around the world. As I said earlier, it is the 4th most abundant mineral found in the crust of the earth. It's found in soil, rocks, any other mineral you can find, and you can also find it in bogs, lakes, and ponds. And it's collected in bogs, lakes, and ponds by a bacteria. If you've ever seen that red kind of foamy stuff on the top of a pond or anything, that is bacteria collecting iron out of the soil and creating bog iron, which is a type of ore. This photo here was from the shop that I used to work in, and my fellow smith, Jake Terradon, took this photo for me because I didn't have one. And this is what the end stage would look like. This is what we call stock. So if you're making something, you'd go and grab one of these random pieces, whether it's flat stock, round stock, square, and you'd make whatever it is that you want to make out of it, like this mulling iron. This is a copy of one from the 1800s, and it's used for mulling cider and other drinks. Heat it up, stick it in your drink or your pots, and it will caramelize the sugars. And so this is a very practical tool that people used when blacksmithing. That one was made as a gift for me by my blacksmithing mentor, Ethan Schwanier, so thanks to him again. And what is smelting? Unlike non-ferrous metals like gold and silver, iron doesn't melt. Well, it can, but we'll get into that a little bit later.
What is ferrous? Sorry.
Ferrous means iron. So if it has iron in it, then it is a ferrous metal, and that comes from the Latin word for iron, and that's why it's Fe on the periodic table. It's from the Latin. So the process of smelting is to extract metal from its ore by heating and melting the ore. And iron smelting melts only the impurities. And from the ore to create slag, which is a type of glass. It is all of the silicates and other materials from the ore that are melted away, and it comes out kind of like lava when you open either your blast furnace or your bloomery. It makes metallic iron molten, so it's very spongy. It kind of looks like and feels like soft caramel, and it falls apart very easily. This is a photo courtesy of Al Kerboy from Lucky Nail Blacksmith. I do have his permission to use these photos. This was my experiment. This was a bloomery that I produced in 2022, and this is what processed ore looks like. So those little marbles on the top is called magnetite ore, and we got it from California, and it has already been processed for us. So it wouldn't look like that if you just dug it right out of the ground, but that's it, ready to go, ready to be used. And that is the top of our furnace. So there are different smelting options when you are doing this process. The earliest type of furnace, and the one that I'm the most familiar with, is a bloomery furnace. They convert the iron ore directly into metallic iron. There's no need to process it to become iron after it's gone into the bloomery. on this, what you can't tell, maybe the end of this anvil here, is the bloom that comes out of the bloomery, and that is the metallic iron after it has been hardened. So this is what we took out. We have to heat it up again in our forge to make it into stock. The other type, the more modern version of making iron, is with a blast furnace. And a blast furnace has much better quantity of making iron, but it also makes it indirectly. It goes from iron ore to cast iron, pig iron, which is iron that has carbon in it. It's kind of turns into steel, and then it has to go through a whole nother process of taking that carbon out to make it back into iron. And this is why a lot of people actually believe that steel was invented first. It's very easy to accidentally get carbon into your furnaces when you're making iron. So the bloomery furnace, as I said, this is what I have most experience with. I've run 3 bloomery furnace experiments. The first one failed miserably. We made it out of a clay chimney, and we put a whole bunch of sand in it to help heat it up, and it exploded and rained molten sand down on us. So we cut that one off really quick, and then we moved on to more historic methods. And so as you can see on our, in this picture here, this is me and Ethan Schwanier. This is after it was opened. It is actually made out of high temperature clay, which they could make, at any point of time that we were making iron by burning quartz, firing quartz, crushing it up, and mixing it into the clay. And that would raise the temperature threshold of the clay so that it could withstand the heats that need to be used to smelt the iron and melt the impurities off of the ore. And it's very hard to control. So when you can't see into this. This is, like I said, it's clay, sand, and peat moss. You can see that you might be able to see that there's a little bit of discoloration on the furnace, and that's because as we were firing it, this lasted 7 hours, we were firing this, and as that was happening, it was cracking, and we had to put more clay mixture onto it so that it would stay upright, because this was over 3,000 degrees, and if that had fallen over, that would have been a little terrible for us. And all of this is by hand and by eye and sound, that's how we decide when things are ready. So in 1200 BCE, this might come as a shock, but they did not have thermometers that go up to 3,000 degrees. At least not that they could stick in a bloomery furnace. Yeah?
What were the earliest tools made from iron?
Sorry?
What were the earliest things that people made out of iron?
Mostly you would find farming equipment or things for cooking. You might also find decorative things like beads or brooches. It's a little bit more.
Weapons?
You would also find weapons, absolutely. So when weapons and tools were being made, they would mostly use iron, and then they would add a steel finish onto the striking end of the weapon or the.
So they can make steel way back.
Oh yeah, absolutely. They were made pretty much about the same time.
Well, what about with the meteor iron? What was that used for?
Pretty much the same thing. So iron is a lot more abundant, and that's why it took over the Bronze Age. So the Bronze has a lot of qualities that are really important for making things. It's very durable. It lasts very well, and it can be casted. So, but you can only find it in a few places.
That's still pretty valuable.
It absolutely, and you can't. It's not as abundant. It's only found in a few places, and so if you're not actively trading with those countries, it would be very difficult to get. And so that's why there was that big shift into
What
the
were
iron.
meteor-rich countries?
Mostly in the But because all of our slag and material is coming down from the top, it started to accumulate onto our thermocouple that was poking in. And so we couldn't rely on that because it was being covered by molten glass. So we couldn't really rely on that, so we ended up taking it out, and we did the rest of this project by sight and sound, and hoped that we were at the right temperatures, because there's a very thin gauge of temperatures before it is too low to even start smelting, and way too high, you've got steel, and when you hit it, when it comes out of the bloomery, it's going to explode on you. The blast furnace is high quantity of iron, and because of this high quantity, these were running for years at a time before they would stop and move on to the next one. Nowadays, they don't do it this way, but they still use blast furnaces, just a much more modern version. The ore it goes from ore to pig iron, which is melted, and then they send it kind of into what looks like one of those bread processing machines, like for pasta, and it kind of like crushes out the carbon, and it turns that into metallic iron. So while this is higher quantity, you have to go through more steps, and this one's a lot more dangerous. There is usually somebody who is opening the gates right next to where the iron is coming out, and that is a scary job. I'm sure you can imagine 3,000 degree iron just going in a lake, like a river, past your feet is a little nerve-wracking. There is more obvious remains for blast furnaces. This is a lot more noticeable. This is from He let me use some of his photos, and this is a blast furnace that I believe is from Connecticut, and it is from the 1800s, and it still lasted pretty well. And as opposed to the bloomery furnaces, where you don't really have that material remains. So there might have been bloomery usages far further into this when people switched to blast furnaces than we're aware of, because we don't have that material remains that we have for blast furnaces. And the first blast furnace was seen in China in the 1st century CE. That's the 1st century of the modern, like the current century, current era. And for a long time, people thought that China didn't have bloomeries at all. They just went straight from bronze to blast furnaces. There's now a little bit more evidence that that's not true, and there's a short period of time that they were using bloomeries. But China really just kind of went blast furnaces all the way, which is very impressive. This is from the bloomery opening. You can see this gentleman here is Al Kerboy, who was so nice to let me use his photos. I am taking the bloom, that piece of molten metal, out of the bloomery there, and we're putting it on that stump, and he's hitting it, condensing it, so it doesn't oxidize. And you can see that stump's on fire, because that metal's really hot. Like I said, it's about 3,000 degrees. And it is exhausting to be standing there in that heat. So as I said, here's some fun facts about iron and making iron. Some scholars believe that steel was invented first by accident because of that carbon content. Cast iron is a type of ferrous metal. It is an alloy. People think of it as just another type of iron, but it is technically its own thing. And ships used to have shipsmiths who would be there to do small repairs that were needed, because you're on the ocean for a very long time, open waters. If your chain breaks on your anchor, that's a problem. So what they would do is they would have very small forges they'd be able to do small necessary repairs until you could make it back into port. And that was so important in the time period, or before trains kind of took over and planes. The black in the word blacksmith refers to the black metals, and that is iron and steel. And that is because the rust that forms on them when they're heated up to starting at 900 degrees will start to turn black. It's called forge scale, and you have to polish it away and take that scale off for it to be that nice silver color that we think of when we're thinking of iron and steel. And so that's where the word blacksmith comes from. Smith means to smite, so you're hitting the black metals with a hammer. You're smiting them. And St. Dunstan is the patron saint of blacksmiths. I don't really know much about him, but he was everywhere in our shop. We had flags and statues of him everywhere in our blacksmith shop. So he was from England, and that's about all I know about him. But he was a very big figure in a lot of blacksmithing communities. And I didn't have this on here, but I'm so passionate about blacksmithing and historical craftsmanship because of the unbroken chain of craftsmen. I was taught by Ethan Chouanier, he was taught by Rob Lyon, and Rob Lyon before him was taught by somebody else, and that chain can go back, if we tried hard enough, to the Iron Age. And I think that is spectacularly amazing, and I love being part of that history, and hopefully being able to continue the chain in the future myself. Yeah.
Can you make anything at all out of just raw iron ore, or is it just crumbly?
It's just crumbly. It's like a rock. You have to smelt it first. Meteoric iron, you don't. You can just heat that up and kind of work with it. I've never worked with meteoric iron, so I'm not sure exactly that process. But for ore itself, yeah, there's a process that has to go through before you can do anything, because there's no.
There used to be this TV show where they had a sword making contest. Did you ever see that?
Yes. Yes, I have seen that show. It's very funny. On a lot of those shows, they have most people nowadays use electric forges, but I was trained as a historic blacksmith and a toolsmith. So I have the only shop that I've ever worked out of was from 1810, and it did not have many modern amenities in it. So I was using a coal forge, and so when I watch shows like that, and their challenge is to use a coal forge, that's just like very silly to me, because I'm like, oh, obviously. But I wouldn't know. I don't think I'd know what to do with an electric forge. So, and that is my presentation, the bulk of the information that I wanted to give to you guys. So I will open the floor up to not just things about iron smelting, but to anything about blacksmithing in general. Yeah.
To your knowledge, is there any formal education, or is it more just passed down from one blacksmith to another?
Yeah, so nowadays you can, it depends. In the United States, there's never really been a blacksmithing training type of thing.
Oh, yeah. Just some snacks.
So in the United States, when people from England were first coming over, the Americas didn't really have any ferrous metalworking. They had plenty of other type of metalworking. In Mesoamerica, they had a lot of gold work, and there is evidence now of there being trade for metal in Alaska with Europe, not with Europe, with Asia. My apologies. During the prehistoric period. But there wasn't smelting really happening here until after the Europeans came and colonized the Americas. And so when, sorry. I got so distracted. Can you repeat your question
Yeah,
for
I was
me?
just wondering if formal,
Yes, okay, so formal,
training,
so when they.
like an
so when they-
associate's degree in
Yeah.
blacksmithing.
So now, there is actually blacksmithing schools, mostly in Europe, that you can go to. Before that, the Europeans had the apprenticeship in guilds. That didn't necessarily translate over to America, which is where I was going, and then I got lost. My apologies. So we did have apprentices here in America, but there was no like official test to decide if you were a master blacksmith, like they had in Europe, where they had the guilds, where people had to go before the guild to apply as an apprentice, and also to show that they had the skill and the resources to become a master blacksmith.
Thank you.
Yes.
So just absolute level zero, how would you explain a blast furnace to like a child?
Okay, so this is the top of the blast furnace. There is a second part on the bottom, and there is kind of like a bloomery suspended in it.
It's like the stack.
Yeah, so you're putting all of the ore, all of the coke, which is a type of fuel that was used. It is pre-burned charcoal, which sounds crazy because if you know what charcoal is, it is already burned wood. But coke is pre-burned coal of any kind, whether that's mineral coal or charcoal, and that gets all the impurities out of the coal, so you have a fresh burn, and that means that you're not getting any other minerals into your iron while you're smelting it, because you have only carbon burning. But there are these things, these pipes that are in the bottom of the blast furnace, and as the ore and the coke are dropping down, that air from those pipes that are called tuyères, it's a French word, it is melting it down, and then it's coming out the bottom. Was that good? Okay. Love to hear it. Yes.
Would you say this is a lost art, or is there a lot of blacksmithing going on in the U.S.?
There is, since the pandemic, and probably because of the show that Jim was talking about, there's been a big re-interest in bladesmithing specifically. So up until the 1840s, there was a big distinction between blacksmithing and bladesmithing. If you were a blacksmith, you were doing what they called jobbing. So somebody would show up to your shop and say, I need my horse to get shoed, or I need a trivet, I need cooking materials, I need whatever, and you'd make it on demand. Bladesmiths only worked with blades. And so you wouldn't go to your general blacksmith, your jobbing blacksmith, and say, I need a kitchen knife, or I need a bayonet. Because that's not really in their wheelhouse. They would probably be able to do it, but not nearly as well as a professional bladesmith would. And the distinctions started in the late-ish 1700s, but became really kind of defined when people stopped doing more jobbing and started only doing horseshoes with the invention of ferrying as its own separate thing. So there's been a couple of, ferrying still exists, that is a type of blacksmithing, and I do know a number of blacksmiths, and there's been a lot more hobbyist blacksmiths because of bladesmithing, and that kind of falls under that umbrella of blacksmithing.
Thank you.
Yes.
What interests you in this? How did you get exposed to it? I mean, a lot of kids don't say, I want to be a blacksmith when I grow up, so how did you get connected?
I with a focus in metalworking, historic metalworking, in Dublin, Ireland in 2021. And I did medieval bronze casting while I was there. And then when I was coming back to the United States, I was like, well, I want to continue doing metalworking. It's a big passion of mine, and I just got my degree in it, so I might as well. And Old Sturbridge Village, the Living History Museum, had a fellowship opening for a blacksmith, and I decided to apply, and I got it, and it was a fantastic experience.
Cool.
Yeah. And I also, on this table here, other than the mulling iron, I do still have some examples of the slag that comes out of the bloomery and the blast furnace. So that's the glass, the silicates, the impurities that are melted away from the ore, and they come out like lava when you open it. And so I have some examples of that here on this table, and I will pass them out and pass them around for you guys to look at. They're pretty interesting. Yes.
Do you know how to identify just iron ore or different types of iron ore?
It depends on the type of ore. You guys can just pass these all around. Depends on the type of ore. If I'm in a kind of, if I'm looking for iron, I'd probably be best able to identify bog iron because there are indications above it where to look for it, and it kind of comes up like in clumps. Other than that, some iron ore will be very magnetic. If it has enough, some won't. It really depends on the amount of iron, and a lot of it just kind of looks like rocks.
They made it the Saugus Iron Works?
Yeah. Mhm. Yes. Saugus Ironworks was one of the first ironworks in the United States. It failed miserably. They were experimenting with what type of coke they were using, so the fuel that they were using, and they got way too much phosphorus in their iron as they were starting out. So everybody was like, hey, this iron really does not work how we want it to, because it had that, it was an alloy. They'd made a phosphorus iron alloy. And so it failed a few years after it started. But Saugus Ironworks is one of the first.
So some
that has-
chimneys or something.
yeah, yes. And they did repurpose it for a little bit, I believe, sometime later. But it has been out of use for very many years. At least a few centuries. Yeah.
On your clay bloomery,
Yes.
what were you burning? The peat moss and straw?
So the peat moss and straw went into the clay. So the peat moss
Oh,
and or straw, you wouldn't use both, you would pick one or the other, is the fibrous structure that keeps your the clay kind of together, standing up. It makes kind of a grid for the integrity of the furnace.
so what were you burning in that to make the heat?
We were burning coke and charcoal.
In the bottom?
In the bottom, yeah. So I don't know why it turned purple.
Oh, is that what that is?
Yeah. So we had opened it. This might have just been from the camera. I'm really not sure because it was really hot, and this picture was taken probably at 11:30 at night. I don't really know what was going on by this point. We'd already opened it. I was the one who was condensing the bloom. So when you can see, I'm wearing a pretty big dress. We were in costume. That's an very accurate 1800s women's dress, and I was a little nervous I was going to set myself on fire when the stump was in front of me, and the bloom is setting the stump on fire, and you just got a sledgehammer that you're like hitting it with. then pieces of the bloom pop off. You've got to pick them back up and just like hope that you don't step on it and set yourself on fire. It was really fun, but but that remains there. That purple is the charcoal, the leftover charcoal from when we opened it up, and that is not, that hole there is not as is way bigger than the original hole that we had there. We, in the end, to get all of the iron out, had to completely destroy the bloomery. And that is one of the reasons that there's not a lot of material remains of bloomeries, because they were pretty much one use.
One use.
You made it, and it didn't take long. We made it, you could make it in a couple of hours, and then you let it sit for a day, let it dry out. You light a small wood fire on the outside and on the inside to cure it. And then you can get started. And it takes about 7 hours to smelt it. And we were very lucky enough that Al Kerboy donated and let us use his electric bellows. And we didn't have to use a hand bellows. But back in the day, people would have been doing it by hand. And that would have been 7 hours of somebody just sitting there pumping a bellows. And that's exhausting. I'll tell you that. Yes.
So how much workable iron did you get out of that?
Not a lot. So that is another downfall of the bloomery, is we put about 20 pounds of ore in there, and we got about 3 pounds back. Yeah. Did you put your hand up? Yes.
So the 1800s probably weren't the century of OSHA compliance.
Correct.
What were some of the safety measures that you would take while working with such items?
Yeah, so this always shocked people, but we always made sure to never be wearing gloves, because when you are wearing fire-resistant gloves, similar to when you're wearing a seatbelt and you might get a little cocky that you're safe, people don't think things through as much when they think they have that safety. So what we would do is, also, that material is not going to be able to withstand 3,000 degrees of heat. It's going to melt into your skin. And so we always made sure that we had cold water available, and that you can't really, I don't know, it's a little difficult to tell because we had just broken open the side, and you can see the bricks on the behind me here, where we had taken out those bricks where we were blocking the opening that we were going to use to take out the bloom. We made sure that that was as clear as possible, and you also can kind of see in the background the very simple rope fence that we used, because this was done in front of the public, and there were a lot of people there. And some people tried to get close. And as we experienced with the first one, when the sand exploded on us, we were very aware that other people who were not trained were going to be kind of watching this and experiencing this. So we gave ourselves a very big, like a large amount of room to be working. And it was as clear as possible. We had people coming by and checking on us, because I didn't notice how exhausted I was after standing next to that heat all day until I was away from it. So we had people coming to check on us, and bringing us like Gatorade and some snacks, so that we could stay hydrated and able to do our jobs, and be safe in that situation, because it could very easily go wrong. Any other questions?
So what kinds of tools have you made personally, and do you have a favorite?
I love making hammers. They're very annoying. Tools in general, when you're doing historic blacksmithing, are really annoying to do, because it has to be an iron body, and then only the striking surfaces are steel, because steel is much harder to get or to get back in the day. It was a harder process because it wasn't as exact as iron. You know, you didn't want any carbon for iron, but you weren't really sure about steel. You could get either really high carbon steel, tool steel as we call it now, or you could get mild steel, which is only just a step above iron in its term of strength. And because the process was so much difficult, it was a lot more expensive. But because of the carbon content, iron and steel have two different welding temperatures. Now, when I'm talking about welding, I'm not talking about arc welding, we call it forge welding, and that's when you put your piece of metal in the forge and you heat it up really, really hot. If it's iron, about 2,500 degrees, and it's hot enough that it gets slightly molten, that you can hammer it together, and that force will basically fuse the pieces together. But because steel and iron have different temperature thresholds, that little bit of steel, because you're only using like that much steel for a hammer, you have to really perfect it, kind of the timing of everything. It's kind of like a dance, and you're dropping tools left and right as you're trying to set up the welds. And so I think all tool making is really exciting, but I specifically love hammers, and especially riveting hammers, because they're smaller and a lot more finicky to deal with. And so once you finally get it and like you make it, you're like, wow, this doesn't look like much, but I just spent 60 hours doing that. It's a great time. Okay, any other questions? Yes.
Just one, because we were talking about the dress you were wearing. Were there a lot of women in blacksmithing at any point?
Yes. So I specialized in the 1830s because that's when Old Sturbridge Village is set, 1838 specifically. But in the United States, there was a lot more stigma around women working, coming from, especially in New England, coming from Puritan belief systems. But we do have record of women blacksmithing, even during this time, especially when people were first coming over, the first colonists were coming over, because you had to use what you had. And that's even kind of what was happening in the 1830s, where what they would do is they would close all the doors in their shop and invite their wife or their daughters or whoever in to come and help them, because either they didn't have the money or there was nobody around to be an apprentice, because you did have to house your apprentice if you had one. You had to house them, and you had to provide them with food and shelter and anything else that they might need. And they just pretend, and your neighbors would just pretend that you couldn't like see them in the window. If the doors were closed, it was kind of like an agreed upon, I'm not gonna look in there, because if your daughter or wife is working, that kind of looks bad on you. You're too poor to get an apprentice. You're too cheap to hire help. But a lot of people knew that, and especially because this is after the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812, women already knew how to blacksmith, right? Because when the men all went off to die, somebody had to keep doing that, to go fight and, you know, do all that stuff. People still had to do that, and we have good records of women in England. There was a woman named Anne, who was a gunsmith in this time period, and her brother trained under her father, and she was the one that became master of the shop. And a lot of people and a lot of women in non-Western countries were doing this. We have really amazing record of the women in India doing blacksmithing. And even if you've ever seen if you're ever interested, looking up Indian blacksmithing is so fascinating, and it is such a beautiful like tandem work between usually a husband and wife team. And there's also a really good Hephaestus is the Greek god of blacksmiths and fire and volcanoes, and it is about African blacksmiths and them using their indigenous folk practices and magic in their blacksmithing to make their things come out better and to kind of protect them against anything that might come during that process. And it's a very, very interesting and exciting look into other types of blacksmithing. I also think it's actually, I just remembered this and I didn't put it in my presentation, but I do think it's very important and very interesting. As we get further away from the colonization of the Americas and closer to the industrial period, we stop seeing so much design in blacksmithing. There's not as much art, it's much more simple. And that's because it was much more easier to come by. You could just go to the store now and you didn't have to necessarily go to your local blacksmith. And so it wasn't as much of a kind of treat to have. So you didn't need to make your skewers look like they were beautiful. You could just have a plain skewer. And that's really interesting because when you look at things from the 1700s, you will see skewers that are like beautiful and intricate and delicate, and then the ones from the 1800s like look like this, but like slightly smaller. But it's just like a straight.
Utilitarian.
Yeah, it's just a straight skewer with a little rat tail. That's what these are called, to hang it, so you can hang it. And the differences between time and access, and the differences between even from Massachusetts to Pennsylvania. The way that the people in Pennsylvania specifically, the Germans that moved there, is way different than the type of blacksmithing that was done in Massachusetts and New England. Cultural differences, and that's really spectacular to see. Well, thank you all for coming and joining us.